We are now joined by Luke Lamprecht, a child protection specialist. Luke, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for your time. Now, very disturbing allegations coming from the Western Cape High Court today. How prevalent is the issue of parents selling their children for financial gain in our country? What factors contribute to this disturbing trend?
Look, I think the factors that contribute to it are, first of all, unplanned and unwanted pregnancies, because I think anybody who could sell their child as a commodity, does not care for and is not attached to their child. So I think that would be the first thing, sort of family planning. And the second would obviously then be financial gain. And it appears in this case that the finances will not necessarily be used to maintain sort of basic needs, that they were being used to maintain a drug habit.
How do cultural beliefs and practices, we're seeing in this case where Kelly's friend is saying that she sold Joshlin allegedly to a sangoma. How do they contribute and influence the prevalence of child trafficking and the sale of children?
I must say, in terms of the sort of muti-sellings and the muti-mutilations and killings, I have seen them in my 33-year career, but they are extremely rare. And when you start speaking to the cultural leaders from the cultures that these so-called sort of sangomas come from, because there are real sangomas and then there are people who are posing as sangomas, who are mutilating children, the cultural leaders will tell you that no culture that anybody knows of in our country will promote the sale and mutilation and the use of children for medicine. We can't find one anywhere.
Sure. So, this case has shown how the community has really stood up in terms of coming forth with the case. How important is that community awareness regarding the dangers of child trafficking and exploitation? What steps can be taken to educate our communities about these issues?
I think the one thing that is very good about the community is that if you have a child that was once there, or you have a pregnancy and suddenly you don't have a baby, people need to be asking questions, because I'll give you an example of the inner city of Johannesburg. We can find 20 discarded fetuses, babies and toddlers a month on the streets of Joburg, and those are children who are abandoned for death. So, that mother was once pregnant and formed part of a community and now doesn't have a baby. Where is the baby? Equally so there was once a toddler, Joshlin Smith. Where is she now? So the community is asking the questions are important. But I do want to say that the community that has come forward as state witnesses appear also to be appearing as state witnesses to benefit themselves, having charges against them withdrawn as being in some ways either accomplices or accessories. So only when they're found out and in trouble do they come forward. They need to come forward beforehand. And it appears that there was lots of drugs involved in this family to begin with.
And I think that was my other issue in terms of drugs and some of the social ills that are experienced in many of these impoverished communities. How much of a role does that play? You do mention it in terms of now people only coming forward only because they're finding themselves in hot water.
So look, the substance abuse definitely plays a role. Look, it plays a role in terms of children being harmed in utero. We know about fetal alcohol syndrome. We know that it plays a role. In the last 6 cases I've given evidence in where children have been murdered by their parents, there is, without exception, there has been either substances or some kind of sort of distorted cultural view attached to the murder. But what you must understand about addictions is that, addictions mean you really choose one thing over everything else. So you choose your high, whether you're numbing yourself to the world or whether you're trying to escape. You're choosing that over being a parent. And, that's why we really need to tackle the substance abuse issue. But at the same time, we can't make substances the reason that these crimes are committed, because there are many, many, many substance abusing families who do not sell and murder their children.
So then what role does social services play in preventing cases like this of Joshlin's? How can they better support at-risk families to prevent child exploitation?
Look, I think it actually starts with child and community health. because we talk about a concept called the war cycle, or the world of abnormal rearing. So what happens is people get caught in the cycle of unplanned, unwanted pregnancies. Then those children become teenagers who have at-risk behaviors. They then end up as teenage pregnancies, who then are not attached to their children, and then they have no sort of grandparental support. So the whole system kind of implodes. And the reason we call it the war cycle is because it wages war on the development of children. And the way to intervene with that is to conceive your child in your mind before you do in your body. So there is a public health, there is a family planning, there is a contraception, there is a termination of pregnancy argument to be made at the beginning. And then once the children are born, you know that there is obviously a need for social services to then intervene in at-risk families, and that those at-risk families only become known as at-risk if they are reported by the communities that surround them. So, you know, it's a community of care right from the time when you care for your child because you planned and wanted your child, right through to the time when you raise your child. Because remember, a parent is the single greatest protective feature for a child against any danger they face in the world, any risk that they face.
Do you think that we have sufficient literacy levels in this country that allow people to engage, like you say, developing a child in your mind before you do with your body? Social services have information for people to consume, but are we accessing this information enough in order for us not to find ourselves in situations where a parent is selling a child?
Look, I think, you know, like I said, it starts with health. I think social services has a role to play. I think the Department of Education has a role to play in terms of how we educate our children and comprehensive sexuality education. So I think it's a whole system approach, because you must remember children have domains of development and parents have the same domains. So we need to appeal to all of those domains to see where we can intersect in that thing I call the war cycle. You know, is it at conception? Is it at pregnancy? Is it at birth? Is it in the first 5 years? Is it in the school-going ages? So I think it's a very complex social problem, and that we need to be given information at every level of that, on every level, so that everybody can access it. So I think literacy contributes, but I don't think literacy is the primary issue. I think a lot of sex in our country is transactional and recreational, and people don't think about sex as conception. They think of sex as a form of transaction, for example, pleasures, or a form of escape, or a form of cheap recreation. They don't think of it in terms of potential parenting.
So in terms of the laws that then exist in South Africa, Luke, to protect children from child trafficking and exploitation, are these enforced effectively?
Look, I think we have some of the most incredible laws ever. And I mean, as I mentioned earlier in the interview, you know, I've given evidence in about 6 cases of child murder recently. And the system is absolutely, I mean, it works like an absolute dream machine at a high court level. But unfortunately, when we're intervening at these kind of high court levels, the children are either missing, dead, murdered, tortured, etc. So we have a system at the end of the process where children are already missing, harmed, mutilated, etc., that seems to very adequately hold accountable, punish and sentence people. But the question is, how did we end up there? And I don't think that we are putting nearly enough in terms of resources and human, financial, intellectual research, programmatic resources into the causes and into interceding on an early intervention risk assessment basis. We always end up with these high-profile high court cases, which then it looks very good that our criminal justice system worked, but we should never have ended up there. The child should not be missing or dead or trafficked or mutilated for mooting. In
the first place. Luke, thank you so much for your time and giving us these insights. It certainly is an eye-opener, and hopefully a lot of these will contribute, especially towards the cases that exist in our country. Thank you so much for your time. That's Luke Lamprecht, a child protection and development specialist.